here, just in case. Hi, first of all, welcome to What to Expect When You're Preserving Supportive Housing. My name is Diane, Louard-Michel. Can you hear me, everyone? First of all, are the acoustics okay? Yes. Okay, great. Because otherwise I just shout to the rafters. I do the Baptist church mom and just like project, all right? But I won't do that. So just welcome to this workshop. I hope this will be, first of all, I hope you all got some caffeine or some chocolate, all right? Because I understand it's the last session of a very fruitful and informative day. We are going to do this in a very sort of loose style, I hope. I'll just give you a little bit about myself. I'm Diane Louard-Michel. I am the Executive Director of Lantern Community Services. We've been around for about 26 years. We do supportive housing, and over the last 5 years I've been doing emergency shelter as well as asylum housing for families with children. Before that, I worked both at HPD in basically housing finance, and I worked for the Corporation for Supportive Housing for a really long time, like 20 years. And so I feel very comfortable in this topic. I'm very excited to be asked to moderate. I've been doing supportive housing since its early days, the late 80s, and when I was with government, and then in the 90s, yes, I started in 1992, and so it's just a topic that's near and dear to my heart. A lot of the people who are in this room may have actually been sort of at the vanguard of what supportive housing was, and we were making the commitments, and we had no idea how those commitments would weather and last. The thing, we were just down there in the trenches making sure that homeless people got housed. We're going to fast forward, it's now almost 34 years later, and we do see that some of our earlier projects are aging, and some of them are not aging gracefully. I do intend to age gracefully, so I will not be a supportive housing project. But there have been challenges. The model has changed. We have changed. The way we finance it, the way we even look at homeless people and their needs for housing and services has changed. And so I'm really happy to be here with 4 people who are coming from various aspects and walks, but who all recognize that this need to preserve, we can't just build our way into capacity. We have to preserve the capacity that we've already invested in. What that means, we have to look at it from some fresh eyes. So I'm going to very quickly just say a little bit. My panelists who are going to go in the order, it's going to be Ross Karp. He's with New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal. He's going to tell us a little bit about what the state's commitment to preserving 3,000 units of supportive housing is looking like, how it's rolling out, what are the challenges and the opportunities that he sees. And then we're going to go to Lisa Silverstone, and she is with Safe Harbors on the Hudson. And back in those early days in the 90s, I actually invested in a project that has now aged, and is at the point where it needed reinvestment and reimagining. And then we will go to Lauren. I'm sorry, Lauren, I just blocked on your last name. LaMack, okay, I just how to pronounce it. And Lauren is with Services for the Underserved. She'll be looking at and talking about a project that they're doing in the city of New York, so that we'll go from upstate to downstate. And it's really interesting, and she'll tell you a lot more about that. And then last, we'll go to Katie Devine from Rockabill, who has been consulting on a wide variety of projects all across the state, different sizes, different capacities, and she'll kind of bring us home. I would like us to try to get to the presentations, but this is really, we do want this to be interactive. It's not about us talking at you. We'd like you to hear, like, what are your concerns? If everybody's has no curiosity and no interest, I do have some pre-canned questions, so don't feel pressure. Do not feel pressure, but I would love it to be coming from the floor and from organically what people in the space who are looking for solutions are thinking and curious about. So with that said, Ross, do you mind coming up? He might give you a little more background information on him, but I just want to keep it at high level.
I'm going to queue up, and then I'm going to sit back down. Because it's 3:30.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so a little bit of background. The state of New York has a 3,000 unit goal for the preservation of supportive housing. That's a very ambitious number. I think a lot of people in this room who have some experience with preservation would agree that that's a lot of units that we're trying to get to. You know, traditionally it's been pretty tough to preserve supportive housing because of, you know, a lack of available capital, lack of available operating service dollars. So, you know, many people are familiar with our program, the Supportive Housing Opportunity Program, which traditionally has been used for new construction of supportive housing. In order to try to hit this 3,000 unit goal a couple years ago, we expanded that program to include preservation projects. That's in an attempt to try to help boost this pipeline, give people a resource that didn't necessarily exist before. I will note HCR, you know, we're a big agency, we have a lot of different programs and they're all pretty flexible. So we have other programs at HCR that supportive housing can be preserved through. So we have a multifamily preservation program. We have our traditional funding streams like our 9% RFP, which has a number of different subsidies within it. We have Clean Energy Initiative funding. We have all these different programs that can also be brought in or can be used instead of supportive housing preservation funding dollars. But we really want to spend this money, and we're really encouraging people to approach us with projects that will help us preserve supportive housing for the long term. So I'm just going to give like a little bit of a background on what that funding looks like and what it's for. You know, like it's the idea is to preserve these units so that they can continue to serve people for 30 plus years. So I think there's been a little bit of a tradition in recent, or, you know, in supportive housing world and preservation in general to just try to address immediate needs, emergency needs. This is supposed to be a lot of money that we're contributing to these projects so that they don't need to come back for 30 years. Like, this is supposed to be a full-scale sort of not necessarily a repositioning, but like, you know, we want to address the full scope of needs, not just like the roof is imminently in danger of collapsing. So, you know, it's a lot of money. We are interested in doing this with projects that have existing state funding, state restrictions, but it's not exclusive of other kinds of projects. You know, we haven't closed a lot of these, but we are, you know, if it's a project that has existing HPD funding and no existing state funding, that doesn't mean we're not interested, but, you know, we're aware that there's a huge portfolio of existing projects with HCR debt, HHAP, OMH, you know, these projects that have had a history of state involvement. So those obviously are the ones that we're like most targeted towards, but it's not exclusive of other kinds of projects. So generally, it's a little easier to move through our process if the projects are around 50 units. That's not a hard number at all. But it becomes a little bit easier to sort of like get the economies of scale, get our staff attention. You know, we are moving these projects with the same staff as do all of our other projects. So, you know, if it's like a really small deal, sometimes it's a little hard to make those happen. What we encourage in those cases is try to bundle projects together, and Lauren's going to talk about that. You know, if there's any way we can put a couple of different buildings that look similar in some way, or they're in a similar geography, or they have similar considerations, to put them into one project, we would highly encourage that. You know, it'd have a minimum 30-year term with a 40-year regulatory agreement. So like I said, this is not, you know, the idea is that we're putting in basically a new capital loan that will last for a while. And it's a lot of money. So this is based on our SHOP new construction term sheet. We're making $150,000 a unit available in capital. Most rehabs don't need $150,000 a unit, but sometimes they do. Mm-hmm. And so we have a lot of funding available. So just talking about scope, like I said, you know, this is meant to be a pretty substantial rehab. We are very focused on sustainability features. So we really want to make sure, you know, if you're commissioning a capital needs assessment, we want it to be one that also includes sustainability features. There's going to be a conversation with our design unit about other ways that the sustainability of buildings can be improved. And we do have some funding in addition called the Clean Energy Initiative that can be paired with this funding. So it's $150,000 per unit plus additional funding to fund specifically sustainability scope items. You know, and the idea is we're extending the existing debt. We might be dealing with the rental assistance. You know, we're trying to take a holistic look at these buildings and set them up for success for the next 30 plus years. Just mentioning, because I know this is a hot topic, I've heard it mentioned a couple different times. So a lot of these old buildings are SROs. We recently changed our policies. So technically in our design guideline, technically all these projects, including rehab, are supposed to follow our design guidelines. Our design guidelines are not particularly encouraging for buildings that have shared facilities. That's been a big barrier for people accessing funding from us in the past for these kinds of projects. We recently changed our policies so that we're opening up this funding to SROs, which is, you know, that encompasses a very large range of projects, but, you know, buildings that don't look like our sort of standard new construction projects, don't meet the same standards for shared facilities and stuff. We are interested in spending this money on those buildings as well. It is a conversation to have with our design group. You know, this is not an automatic yes. I think it's part of sort of looking at these buildings holistically and trying to understand what they need in order to succeed for the next 30 years. If it's an SRO that's really not appealing to people, there's a huge amount of vacancy, you know, it doesn't seem to be working, we want to talk about that. And if our scope is not inclusive of enough items to make this building appealing, like we need to figure out what to do in order to make this a sustainable project. But we are open, you know, we're not requiring people to increase the scope to include transition from SROs to studios. That's not something, I think we all have an understanding that having that requirement would really reduce the number of buildings that are interested in participating in this funding, and we would lose a lot of units. A lot of units would just kind of fall apart and end up lost. So that's not the goal. But the goal is to make sure that if we are going to do buildings with shared facilities with a new 30-year reg or 40-year, that these are high-quality buildings with high-quality shared spaces. You know, maybe the units have, you know, we're talking in some pretty minute detail about how to make these buildings better. So just wanted to mention that because I think that there's been some conversation about how difficult those buildings are, and we are very aware of that. So, okay, operating and service funding. So this is like maybe a thorny topic. We don't have any new sources of operating or service funding. So that's not really part of what we're offering here. You know, we're finding that a lot of people that are approaching us, at least in the sort of like first wave of this, already feel decently about the services and operating funding at these buildings. So obviously, like if you feel that way, it's kind of easier to move this. We are welcoming of PBV being brought into these projects. Obviously, there's not a huge number of project-based vouchers out on the street right now, so not that clear how available those are going to continue to be for these kinds of projects. They also trigger requirements around Uniform Relocation Act from HUD and other things that sort of make these obviously like prevailing wage requirements, so they make the project more complicated. But if that's the only way to do it, well, we're absolutely welcoming of new project-based vouchers. I'm going to flag HCR will consider funding reserves to some degree to address operating deficits. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Cornerstone. It's maybe not the most ideal solution, but if we have $150,000 a unit, sometimes it makes sense to look at what's happening in the operating budget, and if there's nothing else we can do, we can put in some money in reserves to try to address what we know to be future deficits. So that's like, you know, that the magnitude of those we probably want to talk about, but it's something we would consider doing. You know, not every project can take on new debt. We are sometimes waiving our interest rates. Our interest rates are really low on this debt, but you know, some of these projects are just going to be subsidy and maybe some equity or something like that. Like, we're not necessarily expecting these to be paired with new first mortgages or anything like that. And our funding is pretty flexible. We can cover a lot of different items. Let's skip the tax exemption thing. Okay, so I just want to mention this. So we have not closed on a lot of these projects. We're hoping to get to a lot more. We're hoping to really ramp up this pipeline. One of the ones that we have closed is with Safe Harbors on Hudson. It was called Cornerstone Residence. And I'm going to go a little bit through the sources and uses. This might be a little small for everyone, but it's pretty simple, so that's good. So as we can see, the construction sources and the perm sources were the same, and really the only source in this budget is HCR, Supportive Housing Preservation Funding. So that's not so interesting. It was, you know, it's $120,000 a unit. I will flag some of the, sorry, stick my hand in your face. I'm just trying to be dynamic here, gesturing dynamically. So
I'm excited. It's exciting.
in the uses, I pulled out some things that are interesting. So I figured people want to know what our thoughts are on developer/consultant fees. It's not huge, you know, for projects like this that don't have first mortgages, don't have LIHTC investors, they don't have anything. You know, we probably are going to be pretty strict on the amount we all are going to allow for developer fees. And then I do want to flag huge operating reserve that we funded here because this project really had some operating issues and it was really the only way that we could address them. So those were some things that we put into this project. But other than that, you know, it's a fairly simple stack here. We just put in a bunch of capital. We tried to, you know, we refinanced the existing debt and that was it. So if this is the kind of project you're interested in, it's something we want to do. So I'm actually going to pass it off to Lisa now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the interesting meat of the Cornerstone project rather than just the finances.
Okay, so I'll tee up my slides.
Here's this.
Sorry.
So I'm scanning this.
Yeah, this is. You don't want to sit? No.
Should be able to there. Whoops. Sorry. Okay. I can't get it to slideshow, 1 second. Oh, there it is, sorry. Nope.
It keeps going back to the,
Yep.
is anybody, because I can't.
You just have to.
She's coming.
Click.
Wasn't I supposed to hit that to get to slideshow? Oh, on this one. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Like my hands weren't sweaty enough. Now they're sweaty. All right. Now Cynthia from the Supportive Housing Network of New York, who's in the back there, said, you have way too many slides. But I just want to assure you that I'm just going to quickly go through my slides. I won't belabor them, but they just give you something to look at while I chat. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of Safe Harbors of the Hudson and what we are and what we do and kind of what led us to this process through oh, sorry. Nobody seemed to mind. I do have quite a voice. Okay. So Safe Harbors of the Hudson is a mixed-use redevelopment in the city of Newburgh, New York, which is about 60 miles north of where we sit here today, with the mission of transforming lives and building community through housing and the arts. All right. Sorry. Okay. In 2002, Safe Harbors purchased the landmark Hotel Newburgh, which was a wonderful centerpiece in the city of Newburgh, a real draw for many, many years, but had devolved into serious disrepair over the years, and people were living there in absolutely deplorable conditions when we purchased the building. In 2004, Safe Harbors received $16 million in low-income housing tax credits, and that, coupled with other state and federal grants, allowed us to complete a gut rehabilitation of the Cornerstone, transforming the Hotel Newburgh into an innovative model of downtown redevelopment that co-locates and integrates housing for homeless folks with visual and performing arts, centering people in solutions while addressing issues of homelessness and housing equity, and catalyzing downtown revitalization and economic development.
The Cornerstone, or Safe Harbors campus, includes the Cornerstone Residence, which is 128 units of supportive, affordable housing for single adults, including people coming from homelessness, people with mental health diagnoses and physical disabilities, veterans, low-income working adults, and artists in need of affordable live workspace. Nice, thank you. The project includes the Ann Street Gallery, which is a professionally curated gallery space that has 8 adjoining artist-resident studio spaces for resident artists in our building and people in our city. We also have a wonderful performing arts space, the Lafayette DeWitt's Theater, which is our live performing arts that we host throughout the year. Safe Harbors Green, we purchased a vacant lot adjacent to our property in 2016 and created this wonderful urban park for performance, presentation, community gathering, and farmers markets. And circus. We have a youth circus in the city of Newburgh, so you will see kids flying on the trapeze above our city streets, which is pretty magical. The Ritz Theater is part of the complex. When we first purchased the hotel, Newburgh, my predecessor, who's the former executive director, was going through the building and discovered this theater that was embedded into this building, this huge 1,200-seat theater. And the developer she was with said, we can get another 20 units in here. And she said, I don't think so. I think we're going to save this theater. So he walked. And we continue to work to preserve the theater and create a center of state-of-the-art performance venue for our city. So we're about $3 million in. We just completed demo of the stage house, and we're working toward creating this. Thank you. Just recently, Safe Harbors proudly partnered with affordable housing developer, and now Sam's going to leave, developer Bronx Pro, bad timing, Sam, to develop 50 units of affordable supportive housing on a long blighted block very close to our building in the city of Newburgh. But up until now, unlike many of you, unlike many supportive housing developers, we are a one-hit wonder. We built this property with a very strong development partner, Common Ground, which is now Breaking Ground. Once the project was done, there you go, welcome, Breaking Ground. Once the project was completed, Safe Harbors didn't stand up a development arm of our own. We really focused our energies on the campus and of purchasing the park, developing, building out and renting 2 vibrant commercial spaces. We have a coffee shop and a WeWorks type of situation on our lower level commercial, and the theater, of course, and the gallery, and a robust schedule of performing arts and community events. So it was new to us. And I did not come from housing. And Year 15 was definitely a very abstract concept, and it loomed large in the not too distant future, but there were bands to book and bands to play. And I will say I was frankly very trepidatious about the process. But in the meantime, there we go. In the meantime, the building was sorely in need of capital improvements. It was clearly feeling her age. We had persistent leaks and clearly need for a new roof and brick repainting. We actually had falling debris from the parapet that required us to net the building at one point. The HVAC systems were increasingly unreliable and failing. The electric and water bills were soaring. Though speaking to our city representatives and attending conferences like this, I realized that there was a way to recapitalize and re-syndicate the project, but I really didn't know how. So Steve Piasecki from Shea recommended that I speak with a consultant who might help shepherd us through the project, and that was absolutely the best advice I ever got. I was talking to Barbara today from HHAC, and she said there are a lot of smaller projects that are kind of afraid, like I was, about how to start this process. It's a lot. And I think if you don't have the in-house capacity, getting a consultant that can help you through this process is incredibly valuable. We went with Barbara Sogloff Associates, strangely enough, a consulting firm from Providence, Rhode Island. We discussed with them our asset management objectives, and they created a roadmap for us. It seemed that the 4% tax credit was going to be the way to go to recapitalize, and we began that process. These slides get less sexy as we go along. The project becomes this whole thing became a little less sexy as we went along. We began the project with an integrated physical needs assessment, an IPNA. We analyzed the project's operating budgets and future operating and income expenses. We reviewed our limited partnership agreement, and we did, as Ross mentioned, we approached the city to renew our pilot, our payment in lieu of taxes with the city of New York, all in preparation for a 4% tax credit deal. We formed a new LLC. We were ready to go. We exited the partnership. We only had to pay the real estate transfer taxes, so we were teed up. And at that point, as the process was underway and we were beginning to talk to investors, that's when we saw the new term sheet from Homes and Community Renewal for the Supportive Housing Preservation Program. As Ross said, a subsidy that pays up to $150,000 per unit with a very healthy operating reserve to ensure the long-term viability of affordable supportive housing. So the team quickly pivoted away from the 4% tax credits. Oh, that's the list. That's the least sexy. You're not even supposed to be able to read that. It's just to make a point. In the summer of 2022, we began conversations with HCR to assess if we would be good candidates for this program, and we were. So we started weekly meetings with HCR and our consultant, and they provided this comprehensive checklist. It's a 2-page checklist to get us through the process. We started meeting with them every week, and then people were added to that call as the weeks and months went on, including attorneys, the title agency, staff. Barbara was on every call from Homes Housing Assistance Corporation, which was an original mortgage holder in the development, the contractor, the architect, and the checklist here, again, it's really like a recipe. It's a lot of work, but HCR is incredibly supportive and really held our hands through this entire process with their checklist, which includes plans and specifications from the architect, construction budgets and timelines from the contractor, building appraisals, phase 1. There's a lot of environmental work that has to be done. There were management agreements and loan subsidy subordination agreements, cost reviews and energy audits, and as I was telling Barbara, at this point I started to kind of glaze over and let the lawyers and the consultants take over. But our weekly meetings really kept us on track. HCR was incredibly, as I said, helpful and supportive partner in all this. They really wanted to see this deal close. And in December 2023, we closed and became the first HCR supportive housing program in the state of New York. Applause. Construction began in February 2024 and so far has gone surprisingly smoothly. There was one photo that I would have added here, but it came between when this slideshow was due and today. I was on vacation and got a picture of about 4 feet of blown-in insulation blocking one of our residents' doors that apparently got blown right in and blown right down. But other than that, it has actually been a very, very smooth process. The artists and the gallery have been much more cantankerous than our 128 residents have had really no issues with it. So I would say a couple of key things that I would recommend. Be sure to engage that consultant, and when you do, and if you need to, make sure it's somebody that meets your needs, and make sure it's somebody that you like and can work with, because you're going to be working with them a lot. I would also highly recommend that you hire an owner's rep. I brought on a trusted architect who I've worked with on many different projects throughout the years, and he has been an incredibly valuable asset in coordinating and communicating and advocating. I think that I would definitely recommend that. The other key to the success of these projects is communication. There can never be enough communication. So after meeting weekly with HCR and the whole entire team, once the project started, we meet weekly with the architect and us, the owner, the contractor, and members of our team. After that meeting, we have an in-house team meeting with our case management team. After that meeting, we have a meeting with our residents, and then we're constantly knocking on doors, posting bulletins, sliding things under people's doors, so everybody is aware of what's happening in the building, and I think that that has been critically important to the success. And also for us, it's a little different because it's required coordinating, as I said, with the gallery, with the exhibitions, with the public use of the building, with the public use of the park. So there's been a lot of, and with our commercial tenants, so there's been a lot of moving parts there. But my key takeaway is just do it.
because it is incredibly generous program. It's time consuming, but like I said, it's a recipe. You just have to follow the steps of the recipe and you will get there. These are some, just to look through, these are some construction photos of the building. This is our called our green room. This is our function space. This is now Construction Central. We gutted our theater space. They're doing all new tiling in the building, addressing these water issues that have been plaguing us. New paint, new lights. Scaffolding is always exciting in Newburgh, so we have scaffolding. And they've taken down that parapet wall, so this is kind of like, it's like when your house looks terrible before it looks great. We're in that process right there. One other snafu, they did order 59 windows for the Broadway frontage. You can see there, you might see those two that are boarded up. And they ordered the windows 10 inches too short. So 60 or 59 windows came to the building. I had a panic attack that somehow it was our fault. It was not our fault. It was simply somebody wrote 5 feet 6 inches. And somebody ordered 56-inch windows. So that was a little bit of an issue. They took one out to do a demo, and it didn't fit, so now we have a little boarding going on. But otherwise, otherwise, it has been, like I said, much smoother than I would have expected. Get a good team around you, and let HCR guide you through this process. Don't be afraid. Do you want me to tee you up? Do you trust me to do that now? After my debacle? Okay.
I trust you. Hi, I'm LaMack from Services for the Underserved, or SUS. I want to address something that might be obvious. I just want to say, because I am on a panel that's a play on what to expect when you're expecting, and I am up here 8 months pregnant right now. I don't know if they drew inspiration from me or what. But be nice to me, it's hot in here. And they're being very supportive by sitting instead of making me stand. So I am going to talk about our SUS OMH Cluster Rehabilitation Project, which is a mouthful. We often just call it our OMH Rehab Project for short. But first, a little bit about SUS. So SUS is a nonprofit. We've been around for a little over 45 years at this point. We're represented in all 5 boroughs throughout New York City and also in Long Island. We serve over 38,000 people per year through various programs. We employ over 1,800 staff throughout the city. And we provide about $270 million in services each year. And our vision is, we envision a city where everyone has a roof over their heads and is empowered to create a life of purpose. So a big part of what SUS does, and a big part of what I do at SUS, is housing, supportive housing specifically. So SUS's housing portfolio consists of over 120 buildings throughout New York City that we own, manage, or lease. And we own and manage just over 70 of those buildings. And we also have over 1,000 units that are leased by SUS to provide scatter site supportive housing throughout the boroughs. To date, we've developed 20 low-income housing tax credit programs. I had to think about that for a second because we're about to open a couple more. But to date, it's 20. And we have 900 units under construction, and we have nearly 1,400 in our pipeline. Thanks. So I'm going to talk about our SUS OMH Rehab Project, which I think hits every special circumstance that Ross was bringing up before. So it consists of 7 buildings. So 7 buildings throughout Brooklyn, and 1 is in Queens. They're all 100% supportive, and all of them were developed using DASNY bonds and OMH capital between 1998 and 2010. So they're all in that 30-year range and in need of capital repairs. None of them have low-income housing tax credits. 4 of them are mod rehabs, and were actually constructed originally before 1932. And 3 of them are new construction. and 5 of them have social services on site. But like I said, they're all 100% supportive, so we have 2 smaller buildings where the case management comes to the tenants. Like I said, every special circumstance that you can think of here. Oh, and I just want to note that I'm sure most of the people in the room know this, but these buildings are home to New York City's most vulnerable residents. So like I said, they're all 100% supportive. So these are people who are at the highest risk for homelessness, unemployment, untreated medical conditions. So these are our city's most vulnerable residents who are living in these buildings. All right, challenges. I heard a giggle from Ross. So these 7 buildings, like I said, have been operational for decades and need significant capital repairs. Because they are all on our OMH1 contract, they have no reserves or insufficient reserves by design. So the buildings don't have dedicated capital reserves like you would see in a tax credit project or a project that was funded differently. There are OMH capital reserves that we can request from OMH, but they're a little complicated and they're subject to approval from OMH, and it's not an easy system to navigate. And those reserves are mostly available for ongoing maintenance, and there's no recapitalization opportunities, which is a little challenging now that these buildings are aging and they need major renovations as they age. And because of that, we now have high expenses, and they were originally underwritten to break even, so there's no cash flow like you would find in a low-income housing tax credit project. And then I think it's also worth mentioning that these buildings are in neighborhoods that are subject to real estate market forces. A lot of them are in gentrifying neighborhoods. So there's a lot of interest in these buildings, and we really want to make them affordable for decades to come. And we want to make sure, we want to extend the life of these buildings, and as I think Ross was saying, set them up for success for the next 30 years. All right. So opportunities. So we're seeking funding through I want to make sure I get the name right, the HCR Supportive Housing Preservation Program, which is the funding that Ross was talking about, which came out in December 2023, right? Very recently.
I think it was 2022.
2022? Time is going by so fast. Yes, so fairly new program. And we've been working on this project, and we worked a lot, SUS worked a lot with OMH and HCR, and had a lot of support from Shinny over the years on the design of this program, how to fund projects like this project, where there isn't a ton of preservation capital available, and the state put it in the budget, so here we are. So also a big important part of this project is clustering the 7 buildings together. So it's 7 buildings. Some of them are very small, or small by New York City standards. The smallest is 16 units. The largest is 72 units. Most of the buildings in this cluster fall between, they're in the 40, 50 unit range. And it's just difficult, as we all know, it's difficult to find funding to put together the plan with the GC on a building that is as small as 16 units that needs repair. So altogether, it's just over 300 units, and we thought that was a good project size. The projects because it is 7 buildings, they do have different needs. Some of them need a little more work than others. There's an SRO in the mix. So we have a lot of different needs, and because it's clustered together, we can spread that funding amongst the buildings, and that has really been able to help us as well with economies of scale. Also, we have sustainability and resilience opportunities. So we are doing full electrification of at least 2 of the buildings in this cluster. We're, of course, assessing all the units and replacing the fixtures with energy efficient appliances and fixtures throughout the tenant units and common spaces. We're also working with an engineer to assess the heating and cooling systems. And also they're all going to be compliant with local law 97, which my colleague is actually presenting on in a different panel right now. But that's all going to be folded into this project as well. And we're also thinking about climate change and redesigning for flood zones. One of these buildings is actually in the far Rockaways. So it's right in the flood zone, and there was significant damage done to this building during Hurricane Sandy. So we're doing things with that building, like we're moving the electrical equipment from the ground floor up to a higher floor. So if anything happens in the future and water gets into the building, which hopefully it won't, with all of the repairs and improvements we've made, we will be better prepared for it. So yes, so to sum up, and looking forward with this project, the main thing we're looking at here is preservation, obviously. So this project seeks to preserve 300 units of affordable, supportive housing in New York City. A big goal is extending affordability. So with this funding comes extended affordability and the regulatory agreement, hopefully extending affordability and keeping these units affordable in these neighborhoods for these tenants for at least the next 40 years. And sustainability. So as I mentioned, we're renovating them to be environmentally sustainable, climate resilient, and also to set them up for success for the next 30 years and lower operating costs and make sure that we provide safe, affordable housing for these tenants for the next few decades. And yeah, that is pretty much it.
This is the part that I'm most nervous about.
It's on the bottom right. There's like a little slide icon.
Bottom right.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
The fact that I can step up and be the tech hero is like making my day. It's this one.
Thank you. And I'm going to stand not because I don't support Lauren, but because I am ill-prepared and did not print out a hard copy of my slides. So, I'm Katie Devine. I'm one of the principal owners at Rockabill Consulting. A little bit about us. Rockabill is a consulting and development company that has been around for more than 15 years. We work with for-profit companies and nonprofits, primarily nonprofits. That's what we were founded to do. We work with groups to help them meet their affordable housing development and preservation goals. My particular practice is focused on supportive housing and transitional housing. And for reasons I'm not entirely sure of, the last several years, I have found myself doing a good bit of supportive housing preservation. So that's that. I just want to go back one thing. So I have been in New York for about 6 years. Before I lived in New York, I lived in Chicago, and I did supportive housing development all over the Midwest, mostly new construction, 9% deals with like 50 units. And I would proudly stand before local councils, planning boards, things like that, and say, this model that we're doing, it was the early 2000s, this model that we're doing, housing first, housing paired with services, is an innovative, cutting-edge model for housing, and we're bringing this to your community. And then I moved to New York City, and I learned that just like with basketball, East beats West, and that New York City has been doing supportive housing and doing it really well and investing in supportive housing for a really long time. And one of the first things that happened when I got to New York and I got settled and I started working in affordable housing is I started working with Goddard Riverside. And I got really into their SRO buildings. Partially, I think, because of novelty. Chicago does have some that have been converted now to supportive housing, but doesn't have, the same kind of, historical reliance on single-room occupancy housing for a wide range of types of tenants that New York City does. So I'm just going to go through a few of the projects that I have worked on recently or I'm currently working on, kinds of sort of financing that we used, issues that we came across, just to sort of try to capture in a very quick amount of time like what the gamut of supportive housing preservation deals that I see looks like. So New Senate Residence is a Goddard Riverside property. It was converted to supportive housing in 1988, much earlier than the early 2000s. It has 137 units. It has DOHMH and DHS services funding, that like typical cocktail, The only lie in my presentation is that I said it was closing today. It's closing on Monday. I was overly optimistic. But we're gonna make it. We're gonna make it. Eve, are we gonna make it? I think so. So this project faced a lot of challenges that a lot of other SROs face. High number of tenant-based vouchers, which means that a lot of that income can't be underwritten to support debt. No project-based subsidy, very, very, very difficult to lease, even through gaps. Cramped quarters, not enough service space. Also, during the pandemic, there were a lot of issues that a lot of SRO providers experienced with, ventilation, closed quarters, quarantining being impossible, and that really brought to light what living conditions were like in even the very best run SRO residences, right? So, the increased DOHMH contract that happened last year was incredible. That enabled the project to be able to really focus, that enabled us to really focus on figuring out the debt sizing, meaning looking at the income and the expenses, how are we gonna size the debt that would allow us to get done the rehab and the full preservation transaction that we needed to, because income from rent wasn't going to be so necessary to support debt. Income from rent could be used for services, income from rent could be used to support debt, not just to support services, because the increased DOHMH contract covered services. Section 610 is also in this transaction going to be a lifesaver. That allows the units that have tenant or project-based subsidy to collect above the legal rent. Even though we are restructuring rent, it certainly helps, because in many cases the voucher payment standard is much higher than the legal rents, right? So this enables you to maximize how much you're collecting. Because we were in a situation where we can't reduce units here, because it is such tight quarters, we're focusing on improving the service space in ways that we can, which, is minimal, but it does mean some configuration that will be meaningful, because even small changes can be useful. So for example, relocating a security booth from the back of the lobby up into the front. It's gonna make a huge difference, right? And then this is funded with HPD Year 15 program with private debt. So the lender on this is Enterprise. And also we have electrification pilot funding from HPD, because we're doing a significant amount of electrification. So fingers crossed that we close on Monday and that we can start construction. This will be a tenant in place rehab. The Goddard staff has quite a task ahead of them, because although we're not doing substantial work inside the units, the electrification work will require putting in new VRF units, which means that we're going to need to go into tenant units, every single tenant unit, for multiple days. So folks won't be relocated overnight, but there will be a lot of tenant coordination, and that's something that you really need to think about early on in planning a preservation transaction, no matter what the scope looks like, because not only do you need access to tenants' apartments, but you need to seek that access and manage all communications with tenants in a very specific way that is more likely appropriate to come from your social services team than a bunch of real estate guys, right? So another project that I did that I closed last year when I spoke here on a panel about SROs, I stood up here and I said, this deal is closing today, and it did close that day. So St. Francis Residence is 3 SROs in Chelsea, 255 total units across the 3 residences, also DOHMH and DHS funding. This particular program and population is not opposed to SRO housing. The level of service they provide is very, very high. They provide meals for all of the residents in the communal dining room. The SRO model works very well for this group. So we didn't even have any conversations about, are we going to convert? Do we reduce units? Leaving it as an SRO was important. Some challenges that we faced on this one were that the rents were very, very low. St. Francis is what I call a real deal charity. For 40 years, they were charging a couple $100 or nothing to 255 residents. And the rents weren't registered with DHCR. And so one of the first things that we had to do was like, okay, we know we're gonna need to register these rents and we're gonna register them at a really high level, but also we're gonna make sure that the tenants aren't going to have to pay any more than they currently do. Well, then wait a minute, what do you do? Like, how are you gonna pay the rent? How do you support any kind of debt? So we got 24 units of project-based Section 8 from HPD, and that, even 24 units, those rents on 24 units in Chelsea makes a big difference compared to, $200. But St. Francis had to identify 24 residents that were willing to go through the process of taking on subsidy, which can be challenging. And this was a project that we were also able to get some green funding. We got the HPD electrification pilot, and this was done through the Green Housing Repair Program, actually. Not year 15, not a supportive housing preservation program, because we were doing, it was the program that had the highest amount of capital subsidy at the time that did not, that we weren't required to use year 15 because we didn't have any LIHTC in the project. So this project is currently under construction. It seems to be going very well, and it's an absolute, joy to see an organization like St. Francis, which did these 3 projects 40 years ago. Now they're preserving them for the first time, and they're also thinking about expansion, right? Because a lot of supportive housing providers, at least some that I have come into to get to know, haven't done a lot of deals with the city, doing a big transaction, getting big loans, talking about mortgages and subordination and regulatory agreements and revising and amending and all, it's a lot of work, and it can be really intimidating. And I love that my fellow panelists said, hire a consultant, because that's always kind of my first message too, is that if you don't have the capacity, consultants are really helpful, right? We can help navigate through that process. And I think that it's really important that, to point out with St. Francis, that this is an example of a group that once we got through it, and it was not easy, but once we got through it, and now we're in construction, they're able to say, oh, that's not so bad. We want to keep doing more business with the city of New York. We want to house more homeless people with disabilities, and that's amazing, right? And so, that's what we'll figure out next. So I don't just do SROs. I'm working on a project in the Bronx with the Lantern Organization, Lantern Community Services, and Aridi Management that is Silverleaf Hall. This is a project that we just exited the limited partner, so it's really 15 years old. It's 118 units, a mix of studios to 3-bedroom apartments. It's supportive housing for families and young adults. It has some NISHIP services funding. But other than that, it's just reliant on the rents. You didn't see my face. There is no project-based subsidy here. There is a heavy lift to come into local law 11 compliance, local law 97 compliance. This is one where the design trends that were happening in 2004, and I don't just mean like colors or throw pillows, but like the kinds of heating and cooling systems, the kinds of flooring, things that were installed during that era are not holding up. And what that means is utility bills are way higher than they should be. Energy usage is much higher than it should be on a 15-year-old building. And also things like the very trendy bamboo floors that were installed 15 years ago are getting beat to blank by the family, the supportive housing families with multiple children who are living in them and pushing furniture around and running around. And so these are real issues, and this is the kind of thing that, you know, not only did Lantern need to exit their limited partner, but they saw, like, we have real rehab needs here too, and we have a real cash flow problem because we aren't funding, we can't, you know, fund the services that we need to. So we have, we applied for 8 units of project-based Section 8 from NYCHA, which we got, which is great. That will help. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it really, every unit counts. And then we're going through year 15 at HPD. The HPD Preservation Department is working with us on this project, and I think that, you know, HPD is a very good fit for this project because, yes, there are lots of rehab needs, but they are not the same level of rehab needs that require $150,000 per unit. And one thing that I think is important is that when we're looking at an individual client or at least this is how I approach things. If I look at an individual client or a client's portfolio, or even just what I'm seeing in terms of capacity at the agencies and what the agencies are messaging in terms of timeline and priorities, sometimes, and I have to sometimes say to clients, makes more sense to go to HPD because you're gonna get your deal done in less time, because at this moment, the capacity, HPD might have more capacity to prioritize your deal. Or at a certain point, for certain deals, the physical needs are too big and you can't support any private debt. It's important to go to, you should go to HCR because HCR has so much more capital subsidy available. And in this case, HPD made sense because we were already going through the year 15 exit with HPD, and that required quite a bit of due diligence and work. And so we get pretty far down the road and you think, well, we're gonna do the deal with HPD too. One interesting thing that has come up with my work with Lantern is that the funding agencies have expressed an interest in creating larger portfolio preservation deals, right? And so we have heard from multiple financing agencies that they'd like to see us come in, like, don't just bring one building, bring 5, right? Don't just bring one building, bring 7, you know, and do all of those at one time. And you know, it's an interesting moment because absolutely that makes sense to me. You put time and energy, lots of human resources, lots of process, paying lots of consultants and attorneys and banks and everything to do a deal. Why not do it for 500 units versus 50 units? That makes sense to me. It also can, in some cases, make a lot of sense when you're looking at, if you have a cash-starved building and a building that's like operating like gangbusters, if you put them into the same ownership and refinance them together, they can work together to level out, right? And that can be really important. I think that nonprofits should be careful about thinking through what portfolio preservation priorities you might have, just because organizational capacity, I know, is really sometimes a difficult question. And so I wouldn't be surprised if folks are hearing, you know, portfolio preservation is something that the agencies want to see. I would say, you know, look very closely at your portfolio and make choices based on what your organization's priorities are for which deals you're going to bundle together and do. And I mention it while I'm talking about Lantern because I'm going through that process with the Lantern folks right now. Which deals make sense to put together and which don't. Lastly, and this is the sexy one, to borrow a word, Columba Kavanagh and Sisters of Charity Housing. Columba Kavanagh is one of the original SRO providers in New York City. They have 3 SRO residences, about 260 units. Columba Kavanagh and Sisters of Charity are working together to merge leadership and to merge the ownership of these 3 buildings with 2 buildings that are owned and operated by Sisters of Charity Housing Development Corporation. And the 3 SRO buildings, of them, 2 will stay SROs and 1 will be converted to studios. And then the other 2 buildings are family buildings, and they're family buildings where Sisters of Charity currently provides supportive services, but there is no supportive service funding. So what's interesting about this is that we looked really closely at those SRO buildings, and we were like, what can we do? There's 30% vacancy in these SROs. These SROs are in dire need of rehab. They've had some referral issues. They've had some trouble with caps, which they're working on, and have hired new staff who are doing an incredible job, cleaning up. But the short version is, these 3 SROs are not working as SROs. Remember I talked about St. Francis works like gangbusters. Here, these aren't working. So we looked closely with Andrew Knox at ESKW Architects to see, can we convert all of these buildings or some? And the recommendation that he had was we convert 1, the biggest one, because the design will allow for it. The other 2, we might take a few units out and put in a few more bathrooms and create a little more social service space. HCR has been really receptive to that so far. We had our TA meeting, 10 days ago, and that went very well. Obviously, we are going to have to seek waivers to the design guidelines to leave 2 of the SROs as they are. But I think we have a really compelling argument for that. And also, I think this makes a lot of sense sort of as a test case for what those conversions from SROs to studios can look like when not done with LIHTC, because I've done that too. And tax credits is a whole other thing, right? And so I think it makes a lot of sense. There are some interesting things that we're having to deal with. If you decrease the number of units on your DOHMH and DHS service contract because you have literally cut the number of units in your building in half, what does that look like? I don't know, we'll figure that out. Again, there's no project-based subsidy. In order to combine ownership of all 5 of these buildings, we are going to need to get Attorney General approval. That's going to be just a little complicated because it's sort of 2 organizations kind of merging here. So, we're going to work on that with the good folks at Hirsch and Singer. We'll be using the HCR Supportive Housing Preservation Program, HCR CEI for their energy initiatives. And then we are talking to HRA about perhaps putting 1515 on the newly created vacant units, because those new studios we're making are going to be new units. I put 3 question marks there.
Yes.
On purpose. I am not making any promises on behalf of New York City agencies, but I am saying what I'm asking for and what would make a lot of sense. So that's another one. In brief, capital subsidy, HPD term sheets can get you up to $90,000 a unit. HPD electrification pilot can get you up to $1 million a project. They are coming out with new term sheets soon. They'll be higher. At the moment, more updated term sheets, more recent, keep it in perspective. HCR allows up to $150,000 a unit, not $150, $150,000. And their version of the electrification program goes up to $30,000 a unit. There's also Resaway and other kinds of capital sources you can put in. Operating subsidy, again, 3 question marks after new 1515. Project-based Section 8, NYCHA, HCR, HPD. When are they going to have rounds? I don't know. Do they have any? I don't know, but it's worth continuing to ask. And then there's other energy credits that you can pursue. Lots of folks are into that. Call one of those people. We do the underwriting. I am not Bright Power. Somebody asked me a question about solar the other day, and I was like, I don't know. Sometimes if you're these old, a lot of the old supportive housing have kind of wonky property tax abatements. If you have 5 buildings, you might have everything under the sun. The Sisters of Charity in Columbia-Cavanaugh one has charitable exemption, 420C and 420A. Combine it, you have an Article 11 transaction. Okay, well, so we do that. Some things to think about when you're doing underwriting. I can't speak for any agencies or lenders or anything, but things I have seen are, the imposition of additional cash flow sweeps to cover rehab costs. Also, I mentioned things like Section 8, tenant-based Section 8, you can't underwrite it, right? And what is that extra amount of rent that can't be underwritten is called Section 8 overhang. Sometimes that gets swept into a cash flow sweep and used for reserves or to pay for rehab or things like that. It's good to watch out for that. Likewise, other underwriting points, for me, the goal is always to keep the operating expenses where they really need to be in order to operate the property, and to keep the vacancy rate appropriate for what historical performance is, not necessarily what's listed in a term sheet, and sometimes those don't always match. Services funding, as Ross said, there isn't new services funding, so how can we think creatively about cobbling together what exists? And then I mentioned relocation is definitely an issue that all of these projects are going to have, and that you should start talking about right away, even if relocation just means sending someone, out for coffee while you go in and paint their unit. It's important because it takes a lot of time and effort. One thing I would say also is that when you do these deals, closing on your construction closing and converting to your permanent loan, one big gap that we see a lot is that if we're putting in place all these tools to help you get more income to operate your property and pay debt service, your property management plan is going to need to change. You might need to hire more people in property management. The scope of work for your third-party management company or your in-house property management folks is going to change. Work with the financing agencies and a developer partner or a consultant to figure out exactly what that needs to look like, because it's going to change no matter what. That's all I got. Thanks.
So I've got you going to stand up for a minute. Thank you. First of all, can we get another hand? I got so many tidbits. I want, if people have questions, please, just come up to the mic. It'll make it a little bit easier to be heard. But I just want to say a couple little things coming from having done this and looking at Carol Gordon over there and a couple other people across the room. So, few observations. A lot of the projects we're talking about, especially early generation SROs, if you notice, many of them were 100% supportive housing. They had no tax credit. They were financed with DASNY bonds and OMH bonds and everything else, but no tax credits. And it was very interesting, a lot of things, there was an assumption that if you were not-for-profit, you didn't need money to operate a building. I'm so sorry. This is a government assumption. But there's a lot of assumptions that somehow the economic rent would be set at cost, right? And you're a not-for-profit, so your costs are low, so you can run a building in, 2010 on, I don't know, $500 worth of rent, $600 worth of rent, and it didn't have this inflation factor. The second thing I want to say, just an observation, is that a lot of the projects you see that were SROs were actually, and someone just glossed over it, they were like in Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn, and they were in these really hot market areas, right? And now they're spinning off after 30 years, and you didn't have to say it, but people are knocking on your door saying, "Do you want to sell?
Yeah.
Do you want to sell?" And not-for-profits who just the same sort of, I think, moxie and innovation and vision about what it would take, and just grit and determination to house poor people who might be without a home. This is coming right back because we need to preserve those homes for poor people who might not have a home. And yet the tools are changing, the assumptions are changing. We do have a better sense that being a not-for-profit doesn't mean that you have, I tell people all the time, but I don't have, I'm not Fort Knox, I do not have a cash making machine in the back of my thing. I'm just as vulnerable to inflationary trends. I'm just as vulnerable to trends and changes in policy and approach. So what I want to say is just to everybody who's in this room, because you came here for a reason, and all the people who presented, I really appreciate this ongoing, this is what I do, and we're going to figure it out. I want to say to the people who are sitting here, like the Danas and the Rosses and a whole bunch of other people from HPD, assume that we're in this together, right? Because nobody wants to lose the asset. And yet it's going to take some innovation, it's going to take some creativity, it's going to take some flexibility on all of our parts. So that's all I'm going to say for now, but we're all in this together. My last observation was, I used to work at HPD, and then we have finance. We're doing low-income housing for the most part, some supportive, but mostly low-income housing through this vacant building RFP program. So, we're taking stuff back in RAM, and we were investing money, and we're getting a little bit of bank finance, and we're doing all this stuff. And it was really fun, it was really exciting. I worked with a lot of CBOs, and as many supportive housing providers, and then I crossed over to supportive housing. And guess what? I'm sitting here with CDFI, we're financing acquisition and pre-development funding, and I was sitting at one of these board project review committee meetings, and they asked me something. I said, well, you know what? The difference is I went from low-income housing to no-income housing. And what that meant is that you had to be so much more creative. You had to create allies in government to provide the subsidy, or else it's not going to work, right? It was really challenging but refreshing, and we got a lot of stuff done because, Katie, yeah, it is different. New York has been doing this, has been investing a lot of capital and operating and subsidies for a really, really long time. And so we have a lot of success stories, we have a lot of mistakes, we have a lot of things, but we've done it. So that's what I'm going to say. It was not a question. Do people have questions, though, from the floor? I would love to take them. I know it's like 12 minutes of cocktails. So it's all right. I could give you 12 minutes back in your day, but going. Please, thank you, because.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Okay.
So I am the senior VP for housing development at the Bridge. We have a lot of buildings, I have about 11, but below community, 11 buildings.
Oh, Carol, could you get it?
We're getting funding.
Give it to her. Bring it to her.
We're getting funding from actually the New York State Office of Mental Health to do that. One of the biggest questions, one of the biggest problems we are facing is, where do you put people when you are renovating a building and you need to, Lisa, did you have to relocate folks?
So we were in every single apartment.
Everybody's apartment had some level of rehabilitation, some had more. We did what somebody said, we gave vouchers to the deli, so that's right next door, so everybody could go out and get lunch. We have common areas in the building, and we made sure there were snacks and, things happening in those areas. We also left 5 apartments open for relocating people in-house, because we planned well in advance. Checkerboarded. So some had hardwood floors done. Those were the only people that had to move out of their apartments. And I think it was 5 days. So those folks were checkerboarded into empty apartments. And
Within the structure, within the building itself.
that's right, within the building itself.
What happens if you're doing more of a renovation where you need to move people out of the building for, well, with HUD, it's 12 months, and then you have to move them back in, so construction can take longer. Yeah.
So maybe, Ross, have you had any experience with that, or Katie?
Try.
It's really, checkerboard is always the preferred answer, but it doesn't always work.
Our portfolio, like I was saying, our 7 buildings, we have every combination of needs. We do have, our plan for a couple of the buildings is a checkerboarding approach, which is similar, where we're going to leave a couple buildings. The goal is 1 on each floor vacant, and then move people in and out. But we are, like I said, we're doing electrification, and we're really gutting a couple of these buildings. So the plan, one thing we're exploring is leasing a building nearby, renting a building just in the short term, and then moving tenants temporarily over there.
Yeah, that is something.
Yeah.
The problem is finding a building you can.
It's, yeah.
It's a very big problem in New York City.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, it is, and also, I mean, I'm grateful that there are lease-up requirements for affordable housing in New York City. However, when you're trying to relocate residents within a certain neighborhood and you want to be able to keep the costs to a reasonable level, it's tough because you can't just call all your other supportive housing provider friends and say, hey, do you have a vacant unit? Because those units have very serious restrictions about how folks can move into them, right? And so I have a fantasy in my mind about all of the vacant SRO units in New York City, like all those providers coming together and having a big conference call and saying, okay, well, I'm going to do mine in 2025, and you're going to do yours in 2026, and we're all going to move into each other's houses. But like,
I like that fantasy.
Let's set
It's
up
the
that
happy hour
conference.
I don't know if it'll work, but it'd be fun to have a conversation. But we've done, Rockabill clients have done, large scale relocation, and it often means renting market units and including that in your development budget. And it's a heavy, heavy lift.
Yeah, it's a heavy lift.
Thank you. We've also kind of planned ahead for SUS. We've also planned ahead for some of these projects. So what we do is we get to a place where at least 6 months in, we talk to our funders and we let them know we're not going to be accepting anyone. So we start to create those spaces. And to your point, we look at existing vacancies, and one of the things we're careful of is that people may not want to return to their apartments, so we kind of make sure that we put people where they actually meet the criteria for that particular vacancy. So that's some of the things that we do in preparation for the work that we're getting ready to do right now.
Right. And I would just say that, because if you know me, Diane never met a good idea that she didn't like, that she didn't love, that she didn't try to push forward. I don't always succeed. But I do think that sometimes we do have term sheets and we do have, policy and procedures and precedent, but sometimes you just have to kind of ask, can we bend the rules? I believe in rules. I do. I think they create order and all that other good stuff. But I'm like that kind of the coloring book person. You can color just outside the line just a little bit, just stay near the line, stay line adjacent. And sometimes you'd be surprised when something is in everybody's best interest, whether, you can just talk about it and maybe it's a one-off, but maybe you can do something. So that sounds like something that could be in everyone's best interest. It's kind of like vacancy management, right? And, but it's all for the good, because you know it's very short term. I am saying this, Ross, all right? I'm talking to you.
Well, I do want to say, I mean, I think like it's important to note, like, as we've seen here, these are really, every single one of these is completely different. And, you know, preservation is hard enough. Supportive housing preservation it's adding the fact that, like, there's all these different ways they were financed, all these different ways that the rents are being paid, that the services are being paid, different kinds of organizations. Every single building is completely different. And so there isn't really a systematic way to approach this, which I think has been a problem. It's been preventing this from becoming like a rolling thing that people are just doing all the time. Like, we're really, I wouldn't say we're struggling, but like, it's taking work to get these programs off the ground, because it's not like we can write a term sheet that addresses every building. So I think every project that you have has to be a conversation with everyone who's involved. And, you know, I have to say, you know, like, I'm sitting up here, I'm talking about HCR's programs, but, like, you know, obviously OTDA is in the room, like HHAC, HPD is here, OMH is very heavily involved in these projects. Like, we all are involved in this as an initiative in various ways, and we're trying to find all the ways that we can all work together to try to, like, help everyone, sort of guide people through all the complications here and harness each other's, like, pieces of this and skills and willingness and capital and operating money, like, trying to, like, this is a collective effort that we're all working together on, and it's like, you know, the developer and the owners are part of the team here, as Diane said. Like, this is, we're all on the same team. We're all trying to get this done, and each one's going to look different. And so, like, it's really just about having these conversations and saying, like, this is a building, you know, unfortunately, it's 100% occupied. Like, this is great. People really want to live here, but we have to do huge amounts of rehab. Like, where's everyone going to go? Like, it's a conversation we have to have. You know, if you can't do checkboarding, how do we address this in some other way? And I don't think, we don't want to be in a position where we're saying, oh, well, it's not easy enough, so sorry, like, we can't help you, because we don't want to lose these buildings. And a lot of them are in places where we would never be able to build new supportive housing. We need to keep these units, and so I think that we're in a good moment now where people really want this to work, but, like, we all have to work together to figure out what each one looks like.
And I think maybe being the first one, it was tremendously collaborative.
Yeah.
When we were on those calls, there were, you know, things coming up, but you weren't involved at that point, but your colleagues. There was never no, that can't be done, that's not on the sheet, or, you know, we can drop, I think there was a lot of willingness to cover outside the lines, absolutely.
Yeah. But it is a lot, I mean, these take a lot of time, they take staff time, that's something like.
I mean, we started in 2020, and we closed in 2023. I mean, we started before the term sheet we started before the program, but yeah, it was almost 2 full years.
Yeah, it's tough, but we're trying.
All right, it is 4:58. I'm going to give you back 2 minutes. Use them wisely.